This was where Franklin knew he had to be. Just over 2.5 months earlier, in January 1919, former President Theodore Roosevelt had died in his sleep at the age of 60. For Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, it had been not just the loss of a revered American president, but of a close family tie. Teddy was Franklin's 5th cousin and Eleanor's uncle. Teddy's younger brother, Elliot, was Eleanor's father, a troubled soul who had died in tragic circumstances in 1894, when Eleanor was 9. Her Uncle Ted had been an affectionate, if inconstant, presence in her life ever since. He had often welcomed her into his home, including on more than one occasion when his home had been the White House. On the day she'd married Franklin, her 5th cousin once removed, it had been Teddy who'd given her away. For Franklin, Teddy's death held even greater significance. He too shared Teddy's blood, though less of it than did his wife. As 5th cousins, Teddy and Franklin's nearest shared ancestor had been dead for 180 years. In his boyhood, spent in the baronial splendor at Springwood, his family's home in the Hudson Valley, Franklin had known Teddy as only one in a cluster of illustrious Roosevelt cousins. The two branches of the family did not even share political allegiance. Like his father before him, Franklin was a Democrat, while Teddy had been the most prominent Republican of the age. Nonetheless, for much of Franklin's life, few figures had loomed larger than Teddy. Franklin had been schooled along with other sons of privilege at Groton, the Episcopal boarding school in Massachusetts, and at Harvard College. In those places, he'd learned the words that men of his class used when they wanted to explain an interest in the grubby business of politics: service, obligation, duty. But in the career of his famous cousin, Franklin had seen the promise of something more alluring. Teddy, who had ascended to the presidency when Franklin was a Harvard sophomore, was more than a public servant. He was the most famous and admired man in the country, unmatched by any other figure in his ability to inspire awe. In Teddy's vocation, politics, and in Teddy's magnificent rise, Franklin saw a chance to have the most thrilling kind of existence. A life of service and duty, yes, but also of achievement and renown. It was a life of glory, and Franklin wanted it for himself. By the time he reached adulthood, he'd come to believe that glory would be his if he could just make Teddy's path to power his own. He'd gotten straight to it. After Harvard and law school at Columbia, he served a brief, uninspiring stint as a clerk in a Wall Street law firm. One Saturday afternoon, Franklin and other young attorneys passed the time by speaking of their dreams for their careers. While the others spoke of partnerships and appointments to the bench, Franklin laid out a precise path of progress through politics. First, a run for the New York legislature, followed by service in Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, then election as Governor of New York. Years later, one of the other young attorneys present that day would recall Franklin explaining that a man who followed this path has a good chance to be President of the United States. This path was, the other clerks knew, roughly the path that Teddy Roosevelt had taken to the presidential ticket just a few years before. As promised, Franklin won election as state senator at the age of 28, an appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy at 31. Along the way, he carefully molded himself in his cousin's image, a democratic Teddy Roosevelt for the next generation who was known to exclaim "bully" on occasion, and dropped the well-placed reference to Cousin Theodore in casual conversation. When, from time to time, the papers mistakenly improved the family connection to make Teddy his uncle, he did not object. All the while, he watched with hungry wonder as Teddy's reputation had grown ever greater. The newspaper editorialists had struggled to describe the scale of the loss of Teddy. It was, one wrote, the greatest blow the nation could sustain in the loss of a single citizen. The strongest single personality in the world is dead. But for Franklin, the true significance of Teddy's death was what it portended. For the first time, the path in front of him, Teddy's path, was clear. By the spring of 1919, Franklin had served 6 solid years in the Navy Department. It was time to move on to the next stop on Teddy's trajectory, statewide office in New York. Standing in the crowd on Fifth Avenue that morning, he surveyed the rough and noisy world of New York politics, the next Roosevelt, ready to take charge.